Today, I want to talk about data fetching in Next.js. Introduce a new approach using React Use Hook. This hook is used to stream data from the server to the client. Prior to in client components, you would use SWR or React Query, but now next there's a different approach using React Use Hook that's going to allow us to take advantage of these streaming benefits within Next.js. So in this video, I'm going to show you how it works, why you would want to use it versus the prior approach in client components. Not only does it get data in the client side in an efficient manner, but it also allows you to spread data across multiple client components. So to kick us off, we have a nextjs15 application. So inside of our page.tsx, we're just returning the home page component. And inside of the return statement, we have a main HTML tag. We're returning an H1 title that just states blog app. If we take a look at our localhost 3000, we'll notice that we're rendering this content on screen. So now we're ready to display some data. By default, Next.js renders its pages as server-side components. So the first thing we'll need to do is make sure that the file is marked as asynchronous. So the first approach to render data onto the screen is by fetching it from an external API. Example, we'll just set a const named res and set it equal to await. And we're using the fetch method to gather some fake post data. We're going to set the cache method to no cache. That way we're pulling fresh data every time we refresh the screen. Then we'll want to create a const named data and set it equal to the response that we get and convert it to JSON. Once we have the data converted to JSON, we're going to map over and capture the first 5 posts from the post array. And we're just going to render the title and also the post body. And in the event the response is named content, we'll just say post.body or post.content. Now, if we save this and go back to our local host, we'll see that we're now rendering post on screen. This is how we would render data from an external API. Now, let's say that we want to render this data from an actual database. All we'll need to do is comment out this fetch request. We're going to replace it with a Prisma function. What I have is a database connection set up to MongoDB using the Prisma ORM. And I have a note model. And what I'm doing is capturing all of the notes and ordering them in descending order. If I save this file and go back to localhost 3000, you'll notice that we're now rendering posts from our MongoDB database. We see that we have some posts on screen. So right now, there isn't any delay in fetching the data from the server. So we're not noticing any lag when we refresh the screen. However, there are going to be times when there is a delay in capturing that data, particularly if there's a large data set or it just takes some time to do some form of authentication or middleware that might be set up in the project. So to kind of help offset that and to give a better user experience, we could take advantage of the React suspense hook, have a fallback in place in the event that there is a delay in fetching the data from the server. So you may be wondering with Next.js, why wouldn't we just use a loading.js or a loading.tsx file? Well, we could use that, but the biggest difference between the two is that with the loading file, that is just going to pretty much render on the entire page. Sometimes there's static data that we can still show on the screen, like the title of the page itself, or maybe some form or some other information. But if we use suspense, we can actually isolate it to an individual component and show a loading skeleton or something else while we're retrieving that data from the server. So this just kind of allows us to get a little bit more granular with fetching the data, how we display a loading animation to the user on the front end. So to bring in the suspense loading skeleton, let's go ahead and start by adding a directory named components. We'll add this inside of the app directory. We'll start by adding a underscore so that the React router knows that this is a components directory and to not render it as a route. And inside of it, we'll add a file named getnotes.tsx. We'll start by importing the get notes. So what I like to do now is bring in the suspense from React so that we can render a loading skeleton while we're waiting for that data to fetch from the server. So the first thing we want to do is move our data into its own separate component. The first thing we want to do is move our data fetch into its own file so that we can use it throughout the application and not just rely on it within this individual component. So we'll go ahead and copy this and delete it. And in the lib directory, let's add a file named data.ts. Within this file, what we want to do is have the ability to make a request to the server and get all of our notes. So we'll start by indicating the use server directive at the top. Then we want to import Prisma, and this is coming from Prisma. Then we'll want to create a export asynchronous function named getNotes. Inside of it, create a const named data that will make the connection to Prisma, gather all of our notes, sort them in from newest to oldest. Then we want to return that data so we can gain access to it. Next up, we want to use this function within a individual component. So inside of the app directory, let's add a components folder with underscore components. Inside of it, a file named getNotes.tsx. Inside of this file, we want to begin by importing the getNotes function that's going to allow us to get all notes from the database. Then we'll create a export default asynchronous function. We'll name it note list. Inside of the return statement, all we want to do is return the card component that we created in the page.tsx. So we'll just capture this, copy it and delete it, paste it into getNotes. Then we'll need to bring in data. So within the page.tsx, let's just create the const name data, set it equal to await getNotes. We'll be sure to call it. Now, if we go back to the page.tsx, import the note list. If we save this file and go back to our localhost 3000, we'll see that we're still gathering all of our notes. Let's just say that we have a delay in retrieving the data from our database. When we refresh the screen, there is a delay in showing the content. So the way that we can care for this is by leveraging suspense from React. To demonstrate what I mean, what I want to do is set a 3-second delay in retrieving the data from the database and when it's displayed, just so you can see what I'm talking about. Inside of our getNotes function, I'm just going to state that we're going to await the promise for 300 milliseconds, which is 3 seconds, just so that we're demonstrating as if there's some delay in capturing the data from the database. So now if we save this file and go back to our localhost 3000, if we refresh the screen, you notice that it is now taking 3 seconds in order for the page to fully reload. We remove this await, refresh the screen, it loads immediately. So this is going to be more of what you could expect in a production environment where there could be delays in retrieving your data, but you'll still render static data to the users so that they can still see something, and also provide some sort of loading animation. That way they know that data is being retrieved. We can get this done by using suspense. Now that we're gathering the list in a separate component, let's go back to the page.tsx. From here, we have the ability to bring in suspense. So I'll just remove the note list component, begin to type out suspense. You should be able to import this from React. Now, if we paste the note list inside of suspense, add a fallback. And for right now, we'll add a fallback of loading. If we save this and go back to localhost 3000, you'll see that it now reads loading while we're waiting to gather this data from the server. So we can actually improve this by adding a loading skeleton. So inside of the components directory, I'm going to add a file named skeleton.tsx. And we'll just paste in this code, which is going to represent a loading skeleton. We'll close this out. And inside of fallback, we'll remove the loading string. We'll begin to import skeleton. This is coming from /_components. We close out that component, save the file, and go back to localhost. You'll see that we now have a loading skeleton while we're waiting on that information to be loaded from the database. So now this is perfect for server components. This gives us the flexibility to distinguish loading components for individual components on the actual page. Let's take a look at how we would achieve this same feat within a client-side component. So inside of the note list.tsx, we'll start by marking this as a client-side file, and we'll also need to bring in useEffect and useState from React. Inside of the note list component, we'll begin to capture the notes within useState variable. They'll start out with an empty array, and then we'll useEffect to asynchronous fetch all of our notes. Inside of the try catch block, we'll set the response to await.getNotes, which is the server action that we created to fetch all of our notes. Inside of set notes, we'll pass in the response. And if we happen to get an error, we'll make sure that we log it. Now, if we save this file and go back to our local host, refresh the screen, we'll see that we are able to successfully fetch all of our notes. However, we don't have any sort of loading animation to let the user know that we're attempting to gather the notes. So now we have the ability to use React's useHook, which gives us access to the stream data from the server to the client. This is going to allow us to use stream even if we're accessing or using the client-side component. So the way the documentation states that it works is that we start by fetching the data in the server component and pass the promise to the client component as a prop. So now let's look at how we integrate the React useHook into the application. Inside of the getNotes.tsx file, we'll start by marking the file as useClient. We'll import use from React. Then inside of the note list, as the documentation stated, we'll pass in the notes as a prop. We'll use the promise and destructure out the ID, the title, content. And then inside of the function, we're going to use React's use hook and pass in notes, which is essentially giving us access to all of the notes. Then we'll go ahead and save this file, and we'll need to make a couple quick updates to our note list. We'll begin by getting access to the get notes function. This is going to be coming from the libs data directory. Inside of the notes list, we'll need to pass in the notes as props. Now, if we save this file, go back to our localhost 3000, we'll see that we now have access to suspense even inside of a client-side component, thanks to React's use hook that we can leverage inside of Next.js. So I hope you enjoyed today's quick tutorial on data fetching. I'll see you in the next video. Love you, man.